I've done some work for the Corps of Engineers up in Fort Worth, around Waco, and this particular project engineer, Mr. Brown, he's dead now, but he told me one time, said, you can read government specs in the most loose way of anybody I know of. Said, you're the only guy that I know of that can take tar paper and apple boxes and meet the government spec with. I had the privilege when he retired, speaking at his retirement deal, and he and I fought for about a year, and then we got to be the best of friends, because there's so many different ways to read things, and I was always, I guess, uneducated. I had to be practical about my reading of the government spec, be a foot thick, and I'd take those out. And they'd had the same spec for 50 years and is out of date in lots of ways, as far as practicality is concerned. And I had to prove to those people that there's other ways to do that. And all those people that taught me, except one that I think about in San Antonio area. I come down here to build Lackland Hospital about 1952 or 3, and I fought all the way through that. And the Corps of Engineers representative here in town, he had a horrible dislike for me, but he is working for a Corps of Engineers office out of Galveston, Texas. He even undertook to run me off and remove me from the job when we were building Lackland Hospital out here. So I called my boss, who was Mr. Lyda, who I'll tell you about joint venture. I says, I'm about to be removed from this job. I said, you guys better get you another man up here and build this thing, because I can't work with people that never built anything interpreting my specification for me. I like to read it and interpret it like it says. And so they tell me you're not building it according to our intent. I informed them that I couldn't bid intent. I couldn't read intent. I said, I have to read what's on the book, and that's the way I'm going to build it. And that's when he wrote a letter to his superior telling him to remove me from the job. So I called Mr. Lyda, said, you better get you another super up here, because I'm fixing to get run off. And he says, I just come out of the meeting with Mr. Chamber and Mr. Farnsworth. That's the company I was working for. Said, I'll call you back. So a little bit he called me back, and he said, Mr. Laird out of the Galveston district was coming with us in the morning. We're going to come to the job, see what the problem is. What the problem was, Colonel Hand was Mr. Stone's military superior here. Mr. Hand, with all due respect, he's out of West Point, but he didn't know the first word about construction except what Mr. Stone told him down here. And Mr. Stone had his stinger out the day I drove in here because he didn't like the company I was working for. And I guess it roughed him up 2 years before. I tried to convince him I was about half honest and going to do him a good job, but he never could accept that. So Lackland Hospital's all architectural concrete all the way to the top on the outside. So I poured a little wall starting up there on one end, and it had a little honeycomb in between the rock. The vibrator didn't get in there, and so he jumped on that. He wrote Colonel Hand a note and said, remove Lyda from the job because that concrete's not acceptable. He had written me a letter to cut it down. Well, I didn't cut it down that day, so his inspectors reported to him at night, said, Lyda's refused to cut that down, but I knew I was going to cut it down. I sent some men out there that night and cut it down, swept the floor, and all the pieces gone. There wasn't nothing there. And next day, when Mr. Laird from Galveston come up with my bosses, Mr. Stone and Colonel Hand's going to show him that bad wall. And they walked down there. There wasn't a wall. There wasn't a hair. There wasn't nothing there. And you could see him foaming in, and he had Colonel Hand all jazzed up. And I had a portion of the building built up second floor, and the plumber started hanging the old soil pipe, old black soil pipe under there that all the sewer drainage goes through. And they had lost the ball game. They didn't have anything to fuss at. I said, what is it you don't like? I said, I told you to cut that wall down. I said, well, I cut that wall down. I said, I didn't do it the 30 minutes after you wrote me the letter, but this is tomorrow after you wrote me the letter, and it's clean and gone. So they was really in a pickle there, and started on this building and had these old pipes. Plumber had already hung the pipe up there. And Colonel Hand, he had to have something to say, so he looked at me and he says, young man, so I'll tell you one thing. If you're going to think I'm going to accept that pipe in this building, you're out in left field. But it's exactly what was specified, you know. He didn't know enough about it to know that. And I looked over at Mr. Laird, the boss of both of them. He just shook his head like that, you know. And he told him, said, y'all going out to your office, and said, I'll be with you later. And so he and I and Mr. Chamber and Mr. Lott went over to my office, and they said, well, do you ought to finish this job? And I said, I always try to finish everything I start. I said, I don't want to be an inconvenience to y'all. And if I'm losing your money, I don't want to stay here. And Mr. Laird lit his cigar up, and he was head of the Galveston district, which is over San Antonio, and he says, "Well, Gerald," said, "you'd be doing me a good favor if you just stay here and build this thing." Said, "I can see what your problem is." We went on through that job, built a beautiful job, sold it to them, but they were building that for the Air Force. So the Air Force liaison people saw what was going on between Mr. Stone and I, and every time Mr. Stone turned down one of my submittals for material in the hospital, when it got to Air Force people in Dallas, they'd say, "Please accept as recommended by the general contractor," and he got this stuff back. We got it built. Then at Aerospace Medicine over here at Brooks, we got that contract over there. So there Mr. Stone was again. But Colonel Busby of the Air Force and said, "Gerald, please, y'all got that contract. Please go over and build that thing like you did Lackland Hospitals." I went over and same thing started over there. We had lots of interesting. We'll go into those details, but in the end, the company's happy with it. The Air Force is happy with it. Mr. Stone, he never got happy with it. One day, Colonel Busby come in and said, "Gerald," said, "I'm going to retire next month." Said, "Would you like to get rid of Mr. Stone?" I said, "Well, he's an awful nice fellow." But I said, "He's kind of been in my hair a few years." Said, "I think he'd save the government a lot of money if he wasn't on the payroll." And that's all I said. And 2 weeks later, he's gone. They retired him. He went on the way. If you do good work and do a good job, and a lot of people that harbor bad thoughts and hates and things, it catches up with them sometime. Anyway, you probably would have cut that in the tape off, but I couldn't keep and tell you. There's lots of facets to this business. It's hard enough to build a business when people are cooperating with you, but some of those bureaucrats sometimes do more to keep you from building the building than they do to help you build a building. They're on the payroll. Taxpayers pay the payroll, the taxes to build one of these buildings. They ought to cooperate and try to help you build it in the most economical and qualified and constructive way as they can, but sometimes that's not the facts. Of course, lots of times it is true, but I guess sometimes you get in the situation where you got to treat them like they treat you. I remember one time out here at Lackland Hospital, we had one of these inspectors just was instructed to go out and find trouble, so had bricklayers laying long, about 100 yards long, glazed tile in the bottom of the hospital. I said, "We got to work on that fellow. He just caused so much trouble." So I said, "Now, when he comes along, just start leaving out all the wall ties and your tile there, which is specified. We've been putting them in, but he just hang around and create problems." So they left out several wall ties. He made a mark on the floor there where they leave them out, and they played like they didn't notice him. I said, "Now, when he goes on by, take those tile down and put those wall ties just like you do in the rest of it. We're going to break him sucking eggs." So he wrote a letter to me, tell me to tear down the wall that the wall ties were. I said, "I believe they're in there, Mr. Stone." And so we tore down a bunch of that wall. I said, "You write me a letter, tell me to tear down the wall. I'll tear it down. If the wall tie's in there, you're going to pay me for tearing down the wall. If you're not, well, I'll pay for it." So we didn't have any more trouble with him. We weaned him right there. We tore down a bunch of wall, sent him a bill for it, and that's ugly of us to do that. But sometimes people just get so harrowing. You have to devise ways of making them straighten up and live right. We try to do right. Just because a man's an inspector doesn't mean he's God. He puts his britches on one leg at a time, just like I do. So I could cite 100 instances through my life where you had to do something to straighten up people's thinking a little bit. But when there's premeditated hate against or adversity toward you just for personal reasons or something not even your fault, you have to figure out ways to counter that. This is awful trivial stuff we're getting into. We better cut this off. You can cut that part of the tape off, but I want to tell you about it anyway.